So should we go back to a system where you're paying extra points for models with fancier Wargear options or profile upgrades? Let's talk through one common gripe with how 10th edition's points work. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about points on Wargear once more. And after a bit over a year of 10th edition, I thought it could be interesting to revisit the topic, given that it often gets brought up whenever people talk about their criticisms of 10th, and it's maybe one of the things that people most want to see changed. When Games Workshop went about rolling out 10th edition, at least initially it felt like there were a whole bunch of things that were changed or cut in the name of making a more streamlined game, and one of them felt like the culmination of what they've been doing through a fair bit of 9th edition, making Wargear costs for a whole bunch of units out there just completely free. Going from a system where, say, if you wanted a missile launcher or a plasma cannon or something in your unit of regular guys, you'd have to pay an extra points cost for it, to go into a system where you have to pay for just the entire unit, and then they can take what they like out of their fancy Wargear options guilt-free. For a quick sentiment check, I thought I'd ask you guys if you thought that points cost should come back for individual pieces of Wargear in Warhammer 40K. And broadly speaking, it seems to be in the camp of most people would prefer them to come back in some form. 50% of people answered yes, only 28% answered no, and a further 22% answered they don't really care or they just want to see the results. It definitely does feel like one of the things that people just tend to throw out there a bit for one of their reasons why they just don't like the general feel of 10th edition. So for this one I thought it could be good to revisit it, talk through how 40k point system has progressed, some of the positives of the rollout of free points for the units in the game, and then some of the negatives. Just quickly before we start, I'll just give a quick shout out to the channel's Christmas Battle Force giveaway, and this one will be going into its last 24 hours or so before the winners are drawn, so feel free to check out either the channel's Patreon page or the Facebook page. If you'd like to enter for this one, there's going to be 8 copies of your choice from the Christmas Battle Force box sets on offer, and if you're interested in taking part at that, I'll cycle back to it at the end of the video. In 40k's past, beyond the sort of big 40k reboot that they did in 8th edition, typically points costs were printed in their codexes with the unit entries, things like this Tyrannid Zonefolk brood here. They've got their points cost listed as 50 in the top right hand corner of their datasheet, and then any upgrades and things are listed down in their weapon options below. There's an option to upgrade one of them to a Neurothrope for 25 points printed on their rule sheet. That's the way that a lot of veteran collectors will be used to the entire point system working. Points cost listed with the unit, and it's fairly easy to access and see them with both the rules and the points all in the same place, plus paying points for any upgrades the unit has. Though the way of delivery for this did have the downside that points cost never tended to get changed or updated or rebalanced after the codex released. You were just given you one value, and given that Games Workshop doesn't tend to be great at getting things very well balanced when they actually release the codexes, you'd have things that were wildly either underpowered or overcosted, and then they just literally stay like that pretty much permanently until the next codex, which could be the next edition if you were lucky, but not every army got a codex every edition. Then 40k had its great big reset in 8th edition. As part of a bunch of things to try and modernise their wargame a little bit, Games Workshop decided to separate out their points cost onto pages like this. You did get some in the codexes, but otherwise they'd be updated in chapter approved books once every 6 to 12 months that you'd be expected to pay to get, at least if you wanted rules from the official source. Wargear points costs were kind of weird in this one. You'd have the base unit cost where you had a per model points cost, and then each bit of Wargear within the codex would have its own points cost in a different table over on the right. So say a heavy bolter would have the same cost for a faction regardless of whether or not it was on a tank or on an infantry unit, and it could mean that they had some very weird balance situations going on. Sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. In any case though, I feel like the ease of use of this was kind of dire. For a new player who wasn't super familiar with a faction, you'd have to pay the points cost for the individual models and then go combing through the Wargear section for every bit of gear that's listed on their datasheet to see whether or not it even had a points cost, and to pay for it if it did, and occasionally some surprising things had points costs that you might not expect. It was annoying having to look at different pages at the same time to do the points cost just literally for one unit, and that points cost might be separated in say 5 or 6 different areas of the page. In 8th edition, Games Workshop also came up with the idea of power level, kind of weirdly splitting game balance in two, and just going by some very rough and ready numbers that were physically printed on datasheets, each power level kind of roughly equating to 20 points or so. The idea being that these would be the things that you used if you weren't trying to fine-tune balance things quite as well. And they really pushed people to try and use these for narrative play, not listing points as an option for that, even if a fair few people decided to use the power level system and equate to points anyway. I think they were fine for some purposes, though I think the majority of hobbyists didn't really find adding up the points sufficiently irritating with list building and things, though they might have been helpful to some. But there were some things that they really didn't work well for, things with extensive war gear, like say Deathwatch kill teams. You could wind up paying the same power level for a unit that's got vastly more war gear than another one. Then the next big development was in 9th edition, where Games Workshop issued some very different looking points tables, and I must admit I think that these were a massive improvement compared with the previous. You had each unit with all their relevant points cost listed together. It did mean that they were reprinting the same bits of war gear a few times over, but it also meant that you didn't have to have the same war gear cost for the same piece for an entire codex worth of stuff, and things could cost different amounts on different units. They also went a bit further to make a few more basic bits of war gear completely free where it made sense. Say like the weakest version of a heavy weapon on a heavy weapon squad. That would be the default option, and you only paid points if you upgraded it to something nastier. A lot of points cost went to multiples of 5 wherever possible for ease of adding up, and it was also quite well received when they decided to make points changes digital and free, as opposed to asking people to pay for chapter approved books, which just felt completely archaic and redundant in the era where people can just take a photo of a page and that's all they need for their army's update. Then as 9th edition rolled out, a lot of units that needed buffs in one way or another and were rarely played often got those buffs in the way of having a free war gear cost. Things like the squads of Imperial Guardsmen and Plague Marines, I remember getting that, going from having itemised war gear costs for their heavy and special weapons and things, to suddenly going to a system where you literally take whatever you want, take all the fun war gear. That squad suddenly becomes a lot more dangerous, but it does mean that there's no more points in just taking small arms and nothing else to save points. Then that finally brings us to the 10th edition system, where Games Workshop decided to take that system and basically make it entirely game-wide. 9th edition had already simplified things a fair bit, but they radically simplified it far more. There's no more points cost for individual models. You either buy in squads at their higher number or their lower number. There's no more points cost for individual bits of war gear in any way, so it's more the case that you buy the unit and then out of their options you can take literally whatever you want, and now literally all points were coming in increments of 5, which is quite a lot more doable given that you're not messing around with small bits of war gear that in reality have less value than 5 points, and not charging per model means that you can do that, as you don't have to have individual models being say 7 points or 8 points and that being a huge jump for an overall unit. You can just say that this squad is 3 models and say 50 points if you want to. It doesn't have to divide evenly if that makes more sense for balance. It came with a few other trends as well. A few datasheets were split by wargear choices. Things like Predator Annihilators and Predator Destructors with their different guns and special rules. More recently, things like Genestealer Cult Acolytes with their 2 different profiles, and the Blood Angels Death Company with bolt rifles versus melee things. And along with the simplification of wargear came things like a bunch of weapon profiles being consolidated, things like Vanguard Veteran power weapons being consolidated into heirloom weapons, rather than having to balance things like Lightning Claws, Thunder Hammers, power weapons, and more. There was definitely a lot of talk at the time that it basically resembled previous power level, which I think for the most part the community was kind of happy to see the back of. And it certainly had a lot of aspects of that with the fixed squad sizes and the not caring about wargear costs, though in reality I feel like this new point system was far more nuanced than power level, as you're going up and down in increments of 5 points, rather than having to make something 20 points cheaper or more expensive if you adjusted to power level. And 10th edition had every profile rewritten, so it felt like a lot of them were trying to make the different weapon profiles balanced against each other. At least with the on-paper aim being that you could have different heavy weapons that just did different things and were kind of equally valuable, even if of course it doesn't always work out that way. Reaction to this felt really quite mixed. From a previous channel poll that I did near the time, it seemed that around about a third of people were broadly positive about it, about a third were neutral, and about a third were negative. And while there are some big annoyances to it, I feel like there are a fair few positives to go along with it. One thing I did quite like was that there's no real hard feelings about taking fun war gear that isn't really the most impactful to a unit. I felt like maybe it was a little bit depressing, say, in 9th edition and 8th edition, where the optimal loadout for a squad was often just literally the squad with their absolute base war gear and don't upgrade them anymore, particularly for things like base troops such as Astra Militarum infantry squads. Potentially it could give fun things like the sergeant's power weapons and things. Occasionally with certain niche builds it could be good, but for the most part it usually just made sense to keep them absolutely as dirt cheap as possible and have them focus on holding points and dying on the front lines and not caring too much if they got shot down, and save the points for either more men or add on to the threats of your actual damage dealers, without making certain points cost just ridiculously cheap and fiddly like 1 or 2 point upgrades. I felt like it was kind of hard to balance those. I can't help but think it didn't really hurt 40k's fun factor too much just to be able to just say yes, take all the fun fancy gear that your unit can take, and you don't have to worry that you're de-optimizing your unit in some way if you do go with those fun choices. Unit and faction balance has often been kind of horrendous in previous editions of 40k, and I think that one of the aims of this was to make unit balancing easier. It just feels like the Games Workshop design team have got far less of a complicated job if they're seeing a unit that's basically either never getting played or being spammed in every single army list, when things are boiled down to just one single number that you can raise or lower. After a few balance passes of helping out units, either by dropping points or increasing points on the most overpowered stuff, you often get a bit more of a balance building up. Maybe something that's a little bit harder to do if they've got all sorts of weird and wonderful Wargear combinations that same squad could field. Sometimes you could change one set of points cost and have the unit become a problem elsewhere, particularly in different sub-factions or detachments. For all the criticisms of 10th edition compared with previous versions of the game, there's far more stuff that's far more playable than there's basically ever been in Warhammer 40k by my estimations, and certainly compared with plenty of armies from 8th and 9th edition, where you just have loads of units that were clearly the best choice in the army, and lots of units that if you take them, there's just clearly flat out better options out there. I'm certainly not saying that that's not the case for some factions still, but taken as a percentage of the game, I feel like you're more likely to be able to make the vast majority of units in your codex work versus most of the time in 40k's past. When they made the points simpler, it felt like part of it might have been to make points easier to use and army construction easier. I don't really think that this was something that most people were really struggling too hard before though. With the 9th edition system, with those points tables, I think it was easy enough. I guess you might need a little bit less time with a calculator if you're just literally adding up unit headline cost as opposed to paying for a few bits of war gear on each one of them. But overall I don't think that the time saving is particularly huge. I guess maybe just for ease of access of the rules, it's not a terrible feeling to have literally all the army's points on one page. Previously, a lot of armies might need, say, 2 to 4 pages worth of points to fit them all on, so I guess that might be a small improvement, but doesn't really seem like a big one to me. I guess multiples of 5 are a little bit easier to work with, and it certainly seems to have made Games Workshop's army building app easier to do. That one had trouble with all manner of more complicated bits in 9th edition. I do feel like they made things easier for themselves in 10th on that front. The 10th edition free Wargear system does work quite well when unit weapon options are pretty well balanced. Maybe Space Marine and Scepters could be a good example of that. With their damage profile breakdowns, the Assault Bolters tend to be better against lighter infantry to medium infantry in a meaningful way, and then the Plasma Guns have a good role against high saves and big multi-wound targets. They feel like a weapon that really doesn't need different points cost, given that there's good draws to both of them. Maybe things like the Tau Star Scythe suits are alright as well. Both the Flamers and Burst Cannons do seem to have advantages and both get played in different battlefield roles. And there are a fair few other choices out there, where you can genuinely debate between the turret options or primary weapon options of a vehicle or a monster. Otherwise, another small advantage is that lock squad size can balance certain bigger units a little bit more easily as well. Say having 1 points cost for a 10-man squad of cultists is a little bit easier to flex up and down, versus having a points per model here at low values. If say there were 5 points per model, then taking a point off is a massive 20% points cut, and putting 1 point on is a plus 20% gain. Lock squad sizes mean that they can go up in increments of 5, which is a bit more fine-tuned. And also more recently they've embraced the idea of having certain bigger units be a little bit cheaper or a bit more expensive, depending on whether or not they value big synergy or multiple small units. I thought that was a fairly interesting one that maybe wouldn't have been quite so obvious to do with individual points costs, and say have jump intercessors be a bit more expensive if used as their small unit role, but make them a little bit more tempting as a primary damage dealer by making their big units a bit cheaper. Finally, for positives, I often feel like loadout balance tended to be a little bit of a myth anyway. It's not like Warhammer 40k balance with every single unit in the codex has typically tended to be great, and often I feel like Games Workshop was more focused on getting units at least usable in one loadout form, and even with the different itemised points cost for Wargear, you still often tended to see people gravitating to just the same few choices. In 10th edition, with the way it worked, multi-melters tended to be absolutely everywhere, even if they were charged a fairly high price tag for that. A few decisions definitely went away with the era of free points, but even without them, I felt like there was already a good amount of convergence on just playing the same one thing for a bunch of units if you're trying to make an optimised list. And otherwise, if you're playing a little bit more casually in de-optimised fun games, maybe just having a few units that might be getting a little bit less than the points that they paid for maybe isn't the end of the world, even if it's not as feel good looking at the other options that you could have had, I guess. Between all that, I do think that there's a fair few positives to the free Wargear system, though obviously there's a whole bunch of downsides that come with it as well, which tend to be really quite well voiced. The main criticism is that in various different ways, a lot of different Wargear bits just seem not really worth taking, even if to some extent that might have been the case in the previous system as well, but at least in theory land there'd be the option of getting perfect points costs and pretty well everything being playable, and very good reasons to use it between points and rules changes. One of the most obvious failings of this one is when there's squads that have a base Wargear option, and then basically just about every model can take something fancier, so it never makes sense to take that base Wargear option. Death Guard Plague Marines feel like one of the most obvious examples with that. They can take all manner of fun melee weapons, special weapons, and other stuff. So taking a Plague Marine with a bolter really is about the worst thing that you can do, even if that feels like it should be their most iconic weapon. I feel like if we're sticking to the 10th system for them, then they might be a good target for a split datasheet when their codex comes round. Maybe have one version of them with bolters and ranged weapons, and a melee weapon loadout perhaps. Maybe another example of that could be the Astra Militarum Lehman Russ. Whether or not you put sponsons on it could be a bit of a choice in previous editions, and kind of skew the entire unit to be a bit more of a damage dealer as opposed to just keeping it cheap and therefore really quite tough for the cost. Lots of people chose to model their tanks without sponsons as a result, so if you had one of those from say 8th or 9th edition and you decided to field it WYSIWYG without any of the actual sponson weapons, then in 10th edition you're basically just paying for the big guns that it gets but not being able to fire them. It's also a bit limited for say some base squad weapons that haven't had their datasheets being split out, things like Tyrannid Termagant with their 3 gun options. Currently the Spinefist loadout of them just seems to be basically superior compared with the rest, with the damage profile that you get and their special rules, and for the Orc boys, outside of fun and fluffy lists, there's not really too much point in taking shooters over choppers, just as the Orky violence tends to outweigh the value by a fair way. The same sort of thing extends to a whole bunch of more common choices throughout the game as well. Maybe one of the most obvious might be the various Imperial heavy weapons that often tend to be options that you can swap out for each other. In particular, heavy bolters feel pretty underpowered compared with the rest. I feel like they did try and shore things up a bit by giving them sustained hits at the start of the edition, plus limiting the range of the multi-melter and having it go from wounding most vehicles on a 4 or better to wounding plenty of stuff on a 5. But despite that, it still doesn't seem to have been enough for the heavy bolter to be an interesting choice for most armies. And usually if there's just about any vehicle or squad that has the option of taking either a heavy bolter or something else, it's usually worth taking that something else a bit more. Say multi-melters, las cannons or grav cannons for devastator squads, and even for tanks like the Predator Destructor with its anti-infantry type special rule, they're still more commonly fielded with las cannons than heavy bolters as the side sponsons. There's some melee weapons that have it pretty similar as well. Some squads do actually have some pretty good balance between their power weapon equivalent and their power fists, but quite a lot of the common Space Marine stuff is generally going to be taking power fists if they can. It's often something like 4 attacks with a power sword at strength 5, AP 2, damage 1, versus 3 with a power fist at strength 8, AP 2, damage 2. And usually in the context of their squads you want as much help as possible against tough stuff, so the power fist almost always tends to win. These sort of things are kind of hard to fix as well. If you wanted to change all power fist profiles across the game, you'd have to do an enormous messy errata that I'm sure people wouldn't be much of a fan of. So even if they decided to try and fix that little bit of internal balance, then it wouldn't be all that easy. There's plenty of things on individual units, things like Drukhari Scourges who can take splinter cannons or blasters, but it just doesn't make sense to versus the other heavy weapons. That was one that someone suggested on the previous poll I did. Maybe Terminator Assault Squads with lightning claws. They aren't unusable, but with the extra wound that the Thunderhammer ones get, they're at really quite a big power advantage. Space Wolf Wolfen, who don't have the hammers to get their nice invulnerable save with a shield and the big flat damage too. Or the Redemptor Dreadnought, where the Macroplasma is very much seen as the way to go, giving it as much a threat against heavies and tough infantry as possible at range, as opposed to more anti-infantry spam. Even if the weapons are well balanced, it does maybe limit designs a little bit. It means that if you want a tank to have 2 very credible options for its big gun, you can't have one of them be significantly more powerful than the other, even if say it might make sense to have that gun be the scarier one in the lore. For example, the Hammerhead genuinely sees play with both the Ion Cannon for more anti-elite spam, particularly in Montcar with lethal hits, or the big scary tank-busting railgun. That is an example of the system working pretty well for that, but you just wouldn't have the option of, say, a game designer saying that they wanted the railgun to be massively more powerful, as that would just mean that the Iron Cannon would never see play, unless they did something like the Space Marine Predators and things and split the datasheet in 2 with different points costs, which is definitely something that they could do, but it'd add more bloats to codexes if they did that with every unit. Otherwise, it has meant the death of a few whole squad upgrades. From those previous examples from 9th edition, one thing that went away were things like the adrenal glands and toxin sacs for various Tyrannid units. They often didn't necessarily make sense to take, but again that means that that's not really an option to do with a fixed point system unless you have things like a trade-off, like say the Ravager's thorax weapons for a lower save, or Tomb Blades taking shield veins for better saves but slower movement. I guess they're interesting enough, but again it feels like they really have to think through some pros and cons for the unit, rather than just literally saying yes they can have that and they'll be better but they'll cost more. And finally, I feel like you can talk a lot about intelligent game design and things, but I think that maybe the biggest criticism that people might have of the system is just maybe the overall feel of it. Even if units still have options, and they might have had just about as many options as they did before in terms of optimized loadouts, I feel like there's a good feeling that you have a fair bit less list building creativity. It could be a somewhat difficult decision to decide whether or not you're throwing things like hunter-killer missiles or storm bolters on the top of your vehicles, taking non-essential upgrades that could still be pretty useful for damage purposes, whether or not to put a few points into sergeant weapons to try and make a unit a little bit less bad in combat, maybe a bit more debate versus certain special weapons that aren't well balanced rather than just going for high impact things like plasma and melter most of the time. Maybe having a bit more creativity with the size of your squads, going for some more middle-sized ones if it made sense, and being able to use up the last few points in an army list really easily, just by paying for a few fun stuff, as opposed to having to play with enhancements. I feel like perhaps the list building side of 40k did get a little bit more boring with 10th edition, the choice really being about which units you're taking now as opposed to how you're equipping them for the most part, even if there are plenty of things that do have some genuine choices. Overall, it seems that at least according to that previous poll, there seem to be a lot more people who are fairly firmly in favour of itemised points cost coming back, as opposed to keeping the way that things stand. And I guess there could be a few different options they could go from here if they wanted. Maybe you could do something like 9th edition, but keep things really quite minimal. Just go for a few select bits of Wargear that are clearly more powerful than another one, and give them a slightly higher points cost. Maybe things like the Macroplasma versus the Heavy Onslaught Gatling Cannon could have a slightly different points cost for the Redemptor Dreadnought, or just small things like making the points cost for a Multi-Melter and a Heavy Bolter differently if everyone's playing Multi-Melters but not the Heavy Bolters. Feels like you could probably introduce a little bit of that and make some really obvious changes, though I feel like if you go down that route, then I feel like a lot of people aren't going to be happy with stopping things at any one point, wanting even more nuance for other edge cases. It will just be a bit of a judgment call between simplicity and just overcomplicating things. One thing that I've seen discussed quite a bit would be the option of doing something like a base unit versus an upgraded unit, so having sort of 2 points cost, one for a squad that can take, say, base gear like bolters with the Death Guard, and then paying for an upgraded unit where they get all the extra fun kits, and that means that you could have units that function in quite different ways. Again, you could still have suboptimal things in there. If you just took, say, one upgrade, then it could mean that you'd have to basically go for the upgrade loadouts, but I suppose it would be one more option compared with now. Or I guess Games Workshop could really go to town on splitting more datasheets. Maybe things like have profiles for Orc Boys with shooters versus Orc Boys with choppers, Plague Marines with bolters versus melee weapons, maybe Rubric Marines with Warp Flamers versus bolters. But as mentioned, if you just go really heavily into that, then you're just going to create massive amounts more unit profiles of things that look more or less the same bar one change or two. And it kind of feels like that could just be a Wargear choice type thing, but with an extra step and a fair bit more paper used. In any case though, will certainly be interesting to see where they go with it in 11th edition. I feel like realistically that'll be the next time that they think about redoing something like this. Even with the big digital updates they've done for 40k in the past, it really does seem that changing the game's entire point system will be something that they keep for an edition launch if they even do decide to do anything. Maybe they'll stick with the points cost for units, or maybe we'll see some sort of extra layer of nuance and complexity come back. Let me know your thoughts though. Do you think that itemised points for various bits of Wargear should come back in some form? And if so, what would the balance be that you would strike? Finally, as mentioned, I'll just cycle back to the Auspex Tactics Christmas Battle Force giveaway. This one's the channel giveaway for November. And as mentioned, this one's going to be the last 24 hours or so to enter this one if you want to. Winners for this one will get one of their choice of each of the 5 Christmas Battle Force box sets. There'll be 8 winners. There's the Knights, the Dark Angels, the Necrons, the Sisters, and the Tau. Plus there's also an option for a Guard Combat Patrol plus a Rogue or Dawn tank if you want that instead. As ever with the channel giveaways, there's 2 equal ways to enter, both of them links down in the video description. Either support the channel for Patreon for any amount, that gets you automatic entry into the giveaways each month, as well as being the main way to support the channel and keep all the videos coming. So a massive thank you to anyone choosing to support there. Or otherwise, you can enter completely for free via supporting on social media. And to do that, you'd subscribe to the YouTube channel, like the Facebook page, and then actually enter the draw on the giveaway post that appears on the 1st of November UK time. That appears at midnight, so should be live within around about 5 or 6 hours of this going live. That post is then active for 24 hours, and to actually enter the draw, reply to the post with a picture of any 40k mini or imagery, along with your name and the date handwritten within the same photo to stop Facebook bots and spammers from running off with things. Then, after 24 hours, I do the draw, put all the Facebook entries and the Patreon entries once each into a random number generator. That selects the 8 winners, and then they'll be announced on the 4th of November channel update that I do once per month. The models will be posted when I receive my orders of them. The Christmas Battle Forces should be going up for pre-order mid-November sometime. In any case though, feel free to check out the Patreon page or the Facebook page, linked down in the video description, and of course there'll be some further giveaways of fun stuff each month. In any case though, I'll leave that one there for now. Let me know your thoughts as to 40k's point system and whether or not Wargear things should come back. Look forward to hearing all the discussion. Feel free to subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the 40k videos coming just about every day. And finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd like to support, the Patreon page is linked down in the video description. There's a few things with that, such as seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next, and automatic entry into those prize draws, of course. Feel free to check that out if you'd like. In any case though, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.